1942, Arkansas. The man who fathered a child with what was essentially his own clone. A genetic case of the most bizarre order. In the misty hollows of the Ozark Mountains, where isolation bred secrets as dense as the morning fog, there existed a genetic anomaly so rare and disturbing that medical records from that era struggled to classify it. This is not just a story of family trees with tangled branches, but of a bloodline that doubled back on itself in ways that defied the scientific understanding of the time. Our story begins in 1942, in Crowley's Ridge, Arkansas. As America focused its attention on the war effort overseas, the backwoods communities were allowed to sink deeper into their isolation. Concealed among the rolling hills and dense forests was the Harland family homestead, a place few outsiders ever visited. The patriarch, Elijah Harland, was descended from one of the original settler families who had claimed this land in the early 1800s. He had established a tradition that would later be recognized as one of the most extreme cases of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. Their property spanned nearly 500 acres of woodland and small cultivated fields, a vastness that allowed the family to remain largely self-sufficient. Their nearest neighbors lived miles away, and the children rarely attended the local schoolhouse. This isolation was deliberate, a carefully maintained barrier that kept the family's disturbing practices hidden from the scrutiny of the outside world. An unspoken family code had been established by Elijah's great-grandfather. Harlan blood stays with Harlan blood. This phrase, passed down through generations, became more than a motto, it was a mandate. What had begun as cousin marriages in the 1860s had, by the third generation, evolved into something far more troubling. Medical records recovered decades later would reveal that by 1942, the Harland family tree had collapsed inward to such a degree that genetic diversity had been catastrophically compromised. Dr. William Calhoun, the county's only physician during this period, documented his concerns in a journal that would later become key evidence in understanding what transpired. The Harland boy brought in today displays concerning physical characteristics that suggest severe genetic complications, he wrote. The parents refuse further examination or questions about family history. This boy was Thomas Harland, Elijah's youngest son, born with a condition that would later be understood as a rare genetic anomaly resulting from generations of inbreeding. Thomas presented a medical mystery. He was born with facial features so symmetrically identical on both sides that it appeared unnatural, and he also possessed duplicate organs that doctors of the time couldn't properly explain. Modern genetic experts reviewing the case decades later would suggest he carried a rare condition, partial genetic twinning, where portions of his DNA had replicated in a way that effectively made parts of his body genetically identical to his father's, a form of natural cloning previously thought impossible. What makes this case particularly disturbing was the discovery made in the spring of 1942, when local authorities, responding to reports of unusual activity at the Harland property, uncovered evidence that Thomas, then 19 years old, had fathered a child with a young woman who was later discovered to be his first cousin once removed, Sarah Harland. The resulting infant displayed genetic abnormalities so severe that the local midwife initially refused to record the birth. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The secrets of America's hidden bloodlines are being revealed exclusively here, knowledge that powerful institutions have tried to suppress for decades. Don't miss the next shocking revelation. The infant, later named Joseph Harland, bore physical characteristics that baffled medical professionals of the era. Dr. Calhoun's journal describes, the infant presents with duplicated features that mirror both the father and, unusually, the grandfather. It is as though the child carries identical genetic material from both men. Despite this being scientifically impossible according to their current understanding, what Dr. Calhoun was observing, though he lacked the terminology to describe it, was the catastrophic result of a genetic collapse. Thomas, carrying genes that were effectively clones of his father's due to generations of inbreeding, had produced a child with a woman who shared substantial portions of the same genetic material. The resulting infant carried so many duplicate genes that it presented as though Elijah had reproduced with himself, a genetic impossibility that nonetheless manifested in physical reality. County records show that in June 1942, after the child's birth, authorities became involved when Dr. Calhoun raised concerns about the family's welfare. What they discovered at the Harland property would lead to one of the earliest documented interventions in a case of generational inbreeding in American medical history. The Harland homestead stood as a testament to isolation, a weathered two-story farmhouse surrounded by outbuildings that had seen better days, all nestled deep within a clearing ringed by ancient oak trees. When Sheriff James Miller and Dr. Calhoun arrived that June morning in 1942, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for years to come. The family's isolation had bred not only genetic disaster but environmental neglect. The home itself was a reflection of their inward-turning existence, windows boarded from the inside, rooms organized in circular patterns that emphasized family proximity, and walls covered with hand-drawn family trees that, upon closer inspection, revealed the disturbing pattern of intermarriage that had characterized the Harlands for generations. What most disturbed the authorities, however, was the family's reaction to baby Joseph's condition. Rather than seeking medical intervention, the Harlands had created what they called a sanctifying room, a space where the infant was kept separate from others and treated with homemade remedies meant to purify the bloodline. These practices, rooted in misguided folk beliefs rather than malice, nevertheless constituted neglect in the eyes of the law. Elijah Harland, then 62, presented an imposing figure despite his age, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, a dominant trait in the family. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed his actions were not only justified but divinely sanctioned. The Harland line must remain pure, he told Sheriff Miller, according to the official report. What you call wrong, we call preservation. Our blood is special. It carries gifts that outsiders wouldn't understand. These gifts, as Elijah referred to them, were in reality severe genetic abnormalities that had become more pronounced with each generation. The family's isolation had created a dangerous myth that their physical differences weren't defects, but special traits to be preserved and strengthened. Thomas, the young father, presented a more complex figure. Medical reports describe him as having unusual developmental characteristics, including facial features so symmetrical they appeared almost artificial and internal organs that showed signs of duplication, a condition that would later be identified as partial internal twinning resulting from extreme genetic homogeneity. In essence, portions of Thomas's body contained cells that were genetically identical to his father's, a form of natural cloning that resulted from generations of inbreeding. Dr. Calhoun's examination of Thomas revealed something even more startling. Regions of his reproductive system showed genetic markers nearly identical to Elijah's, creating a situation where Thomas's child would carry genetic material virtually indistinguishable from that of the grandfather. As Dr. Calhoun noted in his journal, it appears as though portions of the son's body are genetically identical to the father's. A phenomenon I cannot explain through any known medical science. Sarah, the young mother and Thomas's first cousin once removed, presented with developmental delays and physical characteristics that also suggested severe genetic compression. Interviews conducted by county social workers revealed that she had little understanding of the implications of having a child with her cousin, having been raised in an environment where such relationships were normalized and even encouraged. The infant Joseph bore the heaviest burden of this genetic catastrophe. Born with severe cranial malformations, duplicate external features, and internal organs that failed to develop properly, he represented what modern geneticists would later describe as a genetic collapse, the point at which a bloodline has become so compressed that normal development becomes impossible. County records indicate that on June 17, 1942, authorities removed baby Joseph from the Harland home and placed him under medical care at the county hospital. The decision, controversial for its time, was one of the earliest documented cases of state intervention in a family situation based primarily on concerns about inbreeding and genetic welfare. What followed was a legal proceeding unlike any the county had seen before. The case, recorded in court documents as Arkansas State versus Harland Family raised profound questions about family autonomy, medical necessity, and the limits of state intervention in what was at that time still largely considered a private family matter, regardless of the genetic implications. The summer of 1942 brought more than just humid Arkansas heat to the courthouse in Jonesboro. As the Harland case moved forward, it attracted attention from medical professionals across the state, many of whom traveled considerable distances to observe proceedings that would later be considered landmark in the evolution of family law and medical ethics in America. The courthouse, a modest brick building with tall windows that did little to alleviate the summer heat, became the stage for a case that forced the rural community to confront an uncomfortable reality that had persisted in their backwoods for generations. Judge Henry Woodson, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, found himself navigating uncharted legal territory. The court must determine whether family tradition, regardless of its duration or sincerity, can justify practices that result in demonstrable physical harm to a child, Judge Woodson stated in his opening remarks. This framing of the issue represented a significant departure from previous approaches, which had generally treated family structures as beyond the reach of government intervention. The prosecution, led by County Attorney Robert Foster, presented evidence that shocked even the most stoic observers. Photographs of baby Joseph displaying severe physical abnormalities were entered into evidence alongside Dr. Calhoun's detailed medical assessments. The doctor, called as an expert witness, provided testimony that established the connection between the family's intermarriage practices and the child's condition. Based on my examination and the family history I've been able to compile, it is my professional opinion that the child's condition results directly from the compression of the family bloodline over multiple generations, Dr. Calhoun testified. The father, Thomas Harland, presents with a condition where portions of his reproductive system are genetically identical to his father's, a form of natural genetic duplication that, when combined with further inbreeding, has produced catastrophic results in the infant. The defense, handled by court-appointed attorney James Henderson, argued primarily on grounds of family autonomy and religious freedom. Elijah Harland claimed that the family's practices were protected as matters of faith and tradition beyond the reach of government interference. Henderson presented historical precedents showing that cousin marriages had been legal and even common throughout much of American history. What made the case particularly complex was the lack of malicious intent. The Harlands genuinely believed they were preserving special family traits, not causing harm. This belief, though medically unfounded, was deeply rooted in generations of isolation and misinformation. The turning point in the trial came when Dr. Martin Stevenson, a specialist from Little Rock who had reviewed the case, testified about the scientific principles that explained the Harland situation. Though the field of genetics was still developing in 1942, Dr. Stevenson provided a prescient analysis that helped frame the issue for the court. What we're observing in this family is the result of genetic recombination within an extremely limited pool, Dr. Stevenson explained. When the same genes are repeatedly combined over generations, recessive traits become dominant, and in rare cases, portions of genetic material can express in ways that effectively duplicate previous generations. Thomas Harland isn't merely his father's son. Parts of him are, in genetic terms, nearly identical to his father. If you've ever wondered what happens when bloodlines become too close, type in nature has boundaries for a reason in the comments. Thomas Harland's desperate plea still echoes today. Let your voice join those who understand these biological warnings. This testimony, though somewhat limited by the scientific understanding of the era, provided a framework for understanding how Thomas could father a child that appeared genetically closer to being Elijah's offspring than his own. In modern terms, Thomas had effectively reproduced with genetic material so similar to his father's that the resulting child carried duplicate genetic markers spanning 3 generations, a phenomenon that would later be studied as one of the most extreme cases of genetic collapse in recorded history. The trial concluded after 7 days of testimony. Judge Woodson's ruling, preserved in county records, set a precedent that would influence similar cases for decades to come. While this court recognizes the sanctity of family tradition and the right of parents to raise their children according to their beliefs, these rights cannot extend to practices that result in demonstrable physical harm, the ruling stated. The evidence presented establishes that the family's practice of intermarriage has directly resulted in severe physical impairment to the infant, Joseph Harland, necessitating intervention for his protection and welfare. The judge's ruling sent ripples through the communities nestled in the Ozark foothills. For generations, isolated family groups had operated according to their own customs, with marriages between cousins and even closer relations occurring with quiet regularity. Now, for the first time, state authorities had explicitly labeled such practices as harmful and subject to intervention. The Harland case became both a warning and a turning point. County records indicate that in the months following the ruling, medical professionals throughout the region began documenting family histories more carefully, particularly in isolated communities where intermarriage was suspected. This marked one of the earliest systematic efforts to address inbreeding in American rural communities, decades before genetic counseling would become standard medical practice. For baby Joseph, the court's intervention came tragically late. Despite receiving the best medical care available at the time, his condition was too severe for treatment with 1940s medicine. Hospital records show that he survived just 4 months after being removed from the Harland home, succumbing to complications related to his genetic abnormalities in October 1942. He was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Jonesboro, his grave marker bearing only his name and dates, a quiet testament to a life that would later influence medical ethics and family law. The impact on the Harland family was profound. Elijah, defiant to the end, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing or connection between family practices and Joseph's condition. Court records indicate that he was ultimately charged with child endangerment, becoming one of the first Americans to face legal consequences specifically for inbreeding practices. He served 2 years in the state penitentiary before returning to the family property, where he lived as a recluse until his death in 1956. Thomas's story took a different turn. Medical records indicate that following the trial, he was placed under the care of specialists at the University of Arkansas Medical School, where he became the subject of some of the earliest clinical studies on the physical effects of generational inbreeding. Photographs and medical illustrations from this period show the unusual physical symmetry that characterized his appearance, features so mathematically perfect they appeared almost artificial, yet undermined by structural abnormalities that caused chronic health issues. The most significant findings came from Thomas's internal examinations. Using the limited technology of the era, doctors documented what they described as mirror duplication in several organ systems, a condition where tissues appeared to have developed with genetic instructions so similar that they produce nearly identical structures within the same body. In modern terms, Thomas carried regions of chimeric tissue, areas where his cells contained genetic material nearly identical to his father's, creating a form of natural genetic cloning previously thought impossible. Dr. Harold Jenkins, who studied Thomas extensively from 1943 to 1945, wrote in his research notes, "Subject T presents a medical anomaly that challenges our understanding of heredity. Certain tissues, particularly in the reproductive system, show genetic patterns that appear to be duplicates of the paternal line rather than a natural blend of both parents. This suggests a collapse of genetic diversity so extreme that portions of his body are developing according to nearly identical genetic instructions as those of his father." Sarah's fate is less well documented. County welfare records indicate that she was initially placed in a state institution, where her developmental delays were attributed to genetic compression resulting from familial intermarriage. By 1947, however, she had been released into the care of distant relatives living in Missouri, a branch of the family that had separated from the Harlands generations earlier and avoided their intermarriage practices. The wider Harland family, comprising approximately 27 individuals spread across 3 generations, faced varying degrees of intervention. Younger children were temporarily removed from the property for medical evaluation, revealing a spectrum of genetic abnormalities ranging from mild to severe. These examinations, documented in county health records, provided some of the earliest clinical evidence of the progressive nature of genetic damage through sustained inbreeding. Perhaps most significantly, the case led to a quiet but important change in how local authorities approached isolated communities. Sheriff Miller, profoundly affected by what he had witnessed at the Harland property, instituted regular welfare checks on remote homesteads throughout the county, a practice that gradually spread to neighboring jurisdictions. These interventions, though limited by the standards of modern social services, represented an early recognition that geographical isolation could foster practices harmful to child welfare. As the years passed, the Harland case faded from local memory, becoming little more than a whispered cautionary tale among the older residents of Crowley's Ridge. The family property, once spanning hundreds of acres, was gradually sold off in parcels as the remaining Harlands died or moved away. By the early 1960s, little remained of their presence beyond weathered headstones in the family cemetery and fading entries in county records. Thomas Harland, whose body had embodied the medical mystery at the heart of the case, lived until 1967. His later years were spent in a state-supported care facility in Little Rock, where he continued to be studied by medical researchers interested in the long-term effects of genetic compression. Photographs from this period show a man who had aged prematurely, his once perfect symmetry distorted by the progressive effects of his condition. He died at age 44 from multiple organ failure, a common fate for those with severe inbreeding-related conditions. The scientific significance of the Harland case would not be fully appreciated until decades later. In 1978, when advances in genetic research had made it possible to analyze preserved tissue samples with new techniques, Dr. Tyker Margaret Wilson of Johns Hopkins University revisited the case as part of a broader study on genetic isolation in American rural communities. Her findings, published in the Journal of Medical Genetics *, provided the first scientific explanation for what had occurred in the Harland bloodline. Analysis of preserved samples from subject T confirms a phenomenon previously considered theoretically possible but never documented in humans, Dr. Wilson wrote. Regions of tissue show genetic homogeneity so extreme that portions of the subject's genome are functionally identical to the paternal line, creating what amounts to partial genetic cloning across generations. Dr. Wilson's paper coined the term genetic echo to describe this phenomenon, a condition where extreme inbreeding creates sections of genetic material that effectively duplicate previous generations. This explained how Thomas could father a child that genetically appeared to be his father's offspring. His reproductive cells carried genetic material nearly identical to Elijah's, creating a situation where he had, in essence, reproduced with his own genetic source. The Harland case has since become a cornerstone in medical ethics education, particularly in discussions about genetic counseling and intervention in isolated communities. Medical textbooks now cite it as one of the most extreme documented cases of genetic collapse resulting from sustained inbreeding, a cautionary example of what happens when biological boundaries are systematically violated over generations. The property where the Harland homestead once stood has long since been reclaimed by the forests of the Ozarks. Local historians note that the site was deliberately left undeveloped following a county decision in the 1970s, the land reverting to nature as though to heal the wound in the community's history. Today, only the most determined visitors can find the scattered stone foundations that mark where the family once lived in isolation. The legacy of the case lives on primarily in medical and legal precedent. The legal principle established in Judge Woodson's ruling, that family autonomy does not extend to practices that cause demonstrable physical harm through genetic means, has influenced numerous subsequent cases involving child welfare in isolated religious communities across America. From a scientific perspective, the Harland case provided one of the earliest documented examples of how extreme genetic isolation can produce anomalies once thought impossible. The genetic echo phenomenon observed in Thomas has since been identified in other historically isolated communities around the world, though never to the same extreme degree. If you've watched all the way to this point, it's because you're fascinated by these hidden histories. Leave a comment saying, "I watched it all so I can get to know you and identify who truly appreciates the stories on this channel." Don't forget to subscribe to uncover more of America's darkest genetic secrets. Give this video a thumbs up if you learned something new and share it with others who appreciate these profound historical warnings. The truth about our past must be preserved, no matter how uncomfortable. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Harland case is educational. It stands as a stark illustration of how isolation, geographical, social, and genetic, can distort perception to the point where harmful practices become normalized within a community. The family's belief that they were preserving special traits rather than causing harm underscores how easily misunderstanding can lead to tragedy when scientific knowledge is absent. The case of the man who had a child with his own clone remains one of the most disturbing examples of genetic collapse in American medical history, a somber reminder of biological boundaries that exist not as arbitrary rules, but as essential protections against outcomes that, as the Harlands discovered too late, bring nothing but suffering to future generations.